Coming up next, Sitting at 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is made possible in part by TCI and is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
Good afternoon. I'm Lloyd Anderson, President of City Club. Welcome to our program today. We focus today on the subject of capital punishment with guest speaker Sister Helen Prejean, the author of the book Dead Man Walking. Books are available for sale in the back of the room, and Sister Helen has agreed to sign purchased books. On Friday, February the 11th, join us as we look forward to Oregon's future in this new millennium through the unique perspective of an architect, a landscape architect, a corporate president. Our panel will be composed of Gary Reddick with Sienna Architects, landscape architect Doug Macy, and John Emmerich, president of Norm Thompson. Chet Orloff, director of the Oregon Historical Museum, will moderate. It'll be at the Multnomah Athletic Club. This year's annual fund goal was $100,000. We're a little over $80,000 now. So if you're anxious to write your checks, today's an opportunity. Give them to the staff. We've just kicked off our membership 2000 campaign. This year's goal is to recruit 100 new members between now and March 31st. Members can join in the campaign by sharing City Club with friends and non-members who are here today. Please join us. There's membership applications and information on the table at the back of the room. You may have noticed at many of our programs we have a television screen at the front of the room in which live word-for-word caption of our speakers' remarks are displayed. The captioning is provided for those who may have difficulty hearing and is provided by LNS Captioning Incorporated. Captioning services are provided through grant funds from the U.S. Department of Education. Our board host today is Les Swanson, member of the Board of Governors and an attorney in private practice. He will ask the first question of our speaker. Following Les's question, City Club members, please only ask their questions, and if you would be so kind as to limit them to 30 seconds or less, it would be appreciated. Broadcast of City Club programs this quarter is made possible in part by corporate underwriting from Barney & Worth, Kaiser Permanente Health Systems, Wells Fargo Bank. We're very grateful for their support. In recent polling, given the alternative of punishment for crime or rehabilitation, the public chooses punishment, though rehab may cost less. And the death penalty is the ultimate in this spectrum. The death penalty in Oregon was approved by a vote of the people and continues to have a broad base of support. But passions and convictions run deep, and the public mood can change. We show our compassion now by using lethal injection instead of the electric chair or hanging. Short of federal Supreme Court determination to the contrary, the individual states will continue to determine the direction we take on non-federal crimes. In the forefront on the issue is Sister Helen Prejean. She was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize for her book, Dead Man Walking, and Susan Sarandon received the Best Actress at the Academy Awards in 1996 for her portrayal of Sister Helen in the movie. The book is now being made into an opera. Sister Helen was born in Baton Rouge and has lived and worked in Louisiana, now New Orleans, if I pronounced it correctly.
You're doing great.
all of her life. She's lived in Louisiana all of her life. After completing her master's work in religious education at St. Paul's University in Ottawa, Canada, she taught junior and senior high and became religious education director in her parish in Louisiana. In 1981, she worked at St. Thomas Housing Project with the poor inner-city residents and began counseling death row inmates at the Louisiana State Penitentiary. She continues that ministry today. She's been nominated twice for the Nobel Peace Prize and has been recognized here and abroad for her work to abolish the death penalty. She's been much in evidence here in Oregon this last week in several venues. Sister Helen, we're honored to have you here and to speak with us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Is this mic? It's good. It's good mic, but I want to just get it. Okay. Look, I'm very happy to be here with all of you today. This isn't hard work, you know, to feed you a lunch, and all you got to do is talk for a half hour and answer a few questions. That's not bad. I've been in Oregon 4 days, been to Salem, been to Eugene, been talking to people, as I do all the time now, getting on planes and going to universities and churches and Rotary clubs, and to get the conversation going and the debate going and the reflection going about, do we have to keep doing this of executing human beings? Is this the only road we can go down as a society? I'm going to give you some highlights just in terms of my own journey and some of the things I discovered. It's much more spelled out in the book, and I hope you will get it. It'll give you the whole thing. And then I want to talk to you about some experiences about why I get on the road, what I'm learning from American audiences all over this country. Are we really that tied to the death penalty? Is this something that what do the polls really show about support for the death penalty? It's an interesting question. And then I'll be really open to your questions and your comments as well about what you think about it. The key parts of my journey, and a lot of times now the media asks me, well, you know, aren't you a Catholic nun? Like, don't y'all work with children or in hospitals or whatever? You know, they got the stereotypical thing about nuns and all, which was one of the reasons I wasn't looking for Hollywood to do the movie about the book, because nuns generally in movies, well, we don't do too well in movies. I mean, either you have a lot of fun like Sister Act, but then they come up with these impossible little plots like, well, we got a nun on a desert island with a Marine, and like, what's the nun and the Marine gonna do and all that? And so my community's telling me, don't let Hollywood touch the book. But then it was Susan Sarandon who called me. She was filming The Client in Memphis. She was reading the book. She had to come to New Orleans for 2 days of filming. She said, can I come and meet you? I said, sure. We set this little restaurant to get some good crawfish etouffee. And I'll run out, rent Thelma and Louise, so I can see what she, you know. I'd heard of her, of course I'd heard of her. Everybody heard of Susan Sarandon. But I don't want to be the only one in the restaurant. She's coming in, and I don't know. Look at Thelma and Louise, mix her up with Gina Davis, scene one, follow Gina Davis. Who's that ditzy one who keeps doing more and more stupid things through the whole movie? And I'm going, I like Louise, I like Louise. So then when Susan walks in the restaurant, I'm going to tell you it was a prayer of relief, of just, thank you, God, she's Louise. And the one piece of advice I had been given was, don't sign a contract with anybody to do a film of your book unless it's people you absolutely trust. I mean, we got some lawyers sitting in here today. We know the difference between a contract and a covenant. Covenant is based on trust. Contract is based on distrust. And that's why you dot all the I's and cross all the T's and put in a lot of whereases and whereases and whereases to cover every little loophole you can think of, because it isn't based on trust. Well, I meet Susan Sarandon, and I knew after talking to her that she was a deeply principled person, cared about human beings, cared about human rights. And she was the one who prevailed on Tim Robbins for the movie to happen, because he was busy. He was working on this other project. Actually, it's the movie that just came out, The Cradle Will Rock. and she prevailed upon him. I went up to New York, sat in their living room. We talked about making a movie. And Tim Robbins said to me, he said, you know, it's easy to make a film about something from the past. Maybe in the past it was very controversial, but the dust is settled on it now, like slavery. Anybody can do a movie about slavery, do a film about slavery. We all got a perspective on that now. But to do a film about something that's current and controversial is very, very difficult to do. And so it turned out. All the Hollywood studios have turned down the film right and left because they don't think it can be a box office success. Because their magic formula for box office success is a lot of sex, a lot of violence, you know, and a lot of action. A lot of it was conversations with me and the death row inmate. And they go, Tim, you got a nun in it. We got no romantic element. We can't fiddle with the, no, you can't fiddle with the script, he says. We're not going to introduce that into the movie. The film is about another thing, and it's about redemption. And finally, Polygram Film International picked up Dead Man Walking. They had only had one successful movie, 4 Weddings and a Funeral. They mostly did albums. Today, they are very glad they picked up Dead Man Walking. People stood in long lines in the snow to go see the film, and the film is still, people are renting it, people are looking at it. And the way the film's constructed is, it's not a polemic against the death penalty, where it gives you the 1,482 arguments about why you ought to be for the death, against the death penalty. But what it does is it takes us there to both sides so that a reflection process can begin. And as the governor just said the other night when he introduced me, he said the problem with this thing is, the death penalty, is it's abstract. We're not anywhere near when people are executed. People are behind prison walls. Often it's in the middle of the night, a few choice witnesses. It's abstract. So somebody's being killed in Oregon, being executed tonight. Who sees that? Who knows what goes on there? And so my job, my task is to tell the stories. And the beginning of the stories happens is because first I got involved with poor people. And the whole first part of my religious life, you know, I worked with people. I always loved what I did. I mean, we got high school students sitting here today, and I taught English and religion to students and loved that and worked with people. But I was disconnected from the inner city, from the poor, disconnected when people would be talking about what's important is justice and social justice. I didn't know how to begin to put my hand on that rope. I didn't know. And I didn't know poor people. I didn't know struggling people. So I was like that little girl one time. She was asked to write the essay on the poor. So she wrote an essay. She said, once there was this very, very poor family. The mother was poor. The father was poor. The children were poor. The butler was poor. The chauffeur was. It was a very poor family. And that was kind of like me because, my father was an attorney and I had traveled to Europe by the time I was 16 years old. I had an excellent education. I wasn't in touch. And the first part of the journey, as I tell in Dead Man Walking, was moving into the St. Thomas housing projects in New Orleans and living among poor and struggling African-American people. And boy, what that taught me. It was like there's the tapestry of the great American dream, which I had lived out of. My father had my family. And suddenly I'm behind the back of that tapestry. And they got a lot of cut threads, and they got knots, and they got a lot of loose ends. And I'm watching people struggling against great odds, not only against poverty and the prevalence of drug dealers everywhere and the violence. And sometimes when we as sisters were walking to Mass in the morning, there would be blood on the sidewalk there as we walked because of violence everywhere. And I'm working at an adult learning center where people came who had dropped out of high school. And that's when I really got in touch with my privilege. See, when we privilege, we don't know we privilege. We think, kind of anybody wants to could really do this thing, And people are coming into the adult learning center and they've been through the 11th grade in the public schools in New Orleans and they can't read at a 3rd grade level. And they can't write a basic sentence. And I taught English. And I knew by the time you get to 7th and 8th grade, you work with kids and you can learn. And then I get in touch with, well, why was I so blessed? Well, why did I get such a good education? Why did I have all the resources and the cushions and that just inflamed the passion inside of me to be of service and to help a just society come. And I'm in this soil when one day from the prison coalition office right around the corner from where Hope House was, if you see Dead Man Walking, it opens up in the St. Thomas Housing Projects at Hope House. You see Susan walking up to the front porch. And right around the corner from where Hope House is in New Orleans was the prison coalition office. One day I'm coming out of the Adult Learning Center, friends coming, says, "Hey, Sister Helen, you want to be a pen pal of somebody on death row?" I went, "Yeah, sure, I could do that." I was thinking I could write some letters, and it was 1982. We hadn't executed anybody in Louisiana since the 60s. I think that's all I'm going to be doing is writing letters. God's sneaky with us. You take that one little step, and, oh, yeah, sure, I could write a letter, And so he writes the name of this man down on an envelope for me, Patrick Saunier. I don't have a clue about how this is going to change my whole life. And then his address, which gave me pause, because it was death row. And I had never in my life written anybody who lived on Death Street before. I mean, maybe Avenue A or Liberty Street. Death Street, Waiting to Die Street, Angola, and that's what we call our prison in Louisiana, because it's an 18,000-acre plantation, which has become the prison, and it was worked by the slaves from Angola. So that's what everybody calls our prison, Angola. And so I take that name of that man home, and I write that man a letter. And the name on the other side of that envelope wrote me back. And that's how it began. I wrote and he wrote, and I wrote and he wrote. The next thing I know, I'm becoming aware that he's really alone. His mother had been through a lot emotionally in her own life. She had gone to the prison one time and she almost had a nervous breakdown. She couldn't make herself walk into the building of the people and see that sign, Death Row, who were very serious about killing her boy. She couldn't do it emotionally. And he was saying, "Mama, don't come, Mama." People try to protect their mothers from these things. And so he was alone, and that came through in the letters. Not like he's begging me to come. He was just glad somebody had found him and was writing him letters. And so then I go see him. And I take you through that whole journey. And I know the high school students who are here are, part of a writing class. Just wrote the book instinctively, first person, present tense. So as it unfolds for me, it unfolds for the reader, it unfolds for you. And that first visit, the guards are bringing me through all these gates, locking me in a room. 2 guards going and getting him, handcuffed to a belt in the front, and then leg irons on his legs. He's locked into a cubicle. There's a heavy mesh screen between us. And I look through that heavy mesh screen, and I tell you the thing that surprised me the most. I couldn't believe when I saw him for the first time how human he was. It was his face. He was so human. And I guess in the back of my mind, it was like, oh, all those people on death row, they've done those terrible things. And so they're not quite human the way we are, or they're just described or defined solely by that one deed. Next week, I'm going to death row in Texas. There are 7 women there. I've been and visited with the women in Texas, and with Carla Faye Tucker before the state of Texas killed her. And now the state of Texas is about to kill Betty Lou Beats, who's in her late 60s. She's a grandmother. And the women are all upset. It's another one taken out and being killed, and who's going to be next? And I would venture to say, if in this city club today, any table of people would go to Texas, go into a room, sit down with these women, when you walk out of there, if you would be asked, do you believe in the death penalty for these women? And you have looked in their eyes, and perhaps you've even held hands and prayed with them or talked with them, it would be very difficult for you to say, yeah, we need to kill them. And that's what the governor was saying when he introduced me the other night. He says, as long as it's abstract, we can do it. When we make it personal, we can do it. And so with this man, Patrick Saunier, there he is, there I am. We have 2 hours for the visit. Next thing I know, the guard's saying, time to go, sister, your time's up. And I'm driving back to New Orleans. Then I find out he has a brother, Eddie, who's serving 2 life sentences. And that was my first question about the legal. The whole way that I said, isn't that odd? One brother got death, one brother got life. How did that happen? That was only the beginning. You do know, don't you, that now, as of this time, there are now 87 people who've been able to show their innocence and come off of death row in the United States. And the reason, we can point to a number of factors. How could people like Anthony Porter in Illinois sit there for 15 years? And the courts are looking at it and reviewing it and upholding it. 87 people, Anthony Porter. Most of the people who sit on death row, overwhelmingly, 99% easy, are poor people. And a lot translates in this country as to what kind of resources you get if you have financial resources or if you don't. And I was at a workshop with Johnny Cochran one time, and he said, we got the OJs of the world and the no-Js of the world. You're never going to find the OJs on death row. And of course, he knew that very well about OJ. But the no-Js, all of those we find on death row are no-Js, are the poor. And that translates into what kind of do you get an investigator or not? Is there money for expert witnesses or not? All of that translates into that. Now, some states have excellent systems of defense. Most states don't, though. Louisiana, with my daddy being an attorney, I'm going to tell you, I was so naive, I thought, well, maybe he didn't have the best attorney in the world, but surely this is the United States of America. Nobody's going to go to death row that at least didn't have decent defense. And I'm going to find out as I accompany this man down this road to his execution that lawyer who was appointed, who had never had a capital case before, visited with him for 2 half-hour periods to prepare his defense. And one of the half hours was on the morning of the trial. And so I'm going to be introduced into this. You know the expression, capital punishment means them without the capital get the punishment? That's where that comes from. Because what kind of defense can you get? A jury profile. Anytime you talk with criminal defense lawyers or just lawyers that go at trial lawyers, you know 90% of it is picking the jury. What kind of jury do you have sitting there who's going to listen to that evidence? Are they going to be for you? Are they going to have a bias again? Picking the jury. These juries in these cases like Pat's, it was picked in a day, 3/4 of a day. Boom, there's a jury. By Thursday night, they found him guilty. By Friday, they had sentenced him to death. And so you come up against the inequities of the system, you know. And then sometimes you hear people say, well, look, let's just make it fair. Let's just go get them all. Go get them all. Let's just put in whatever we need to do to get them all. We're never going to get them all. I mean, there's 17,000 homicides in this country every year. You know what percentage of people are chosen for death? 1.5%, 1.5 to 2%. It's always been a very selective process. And it's not just poverty or money that makes a difference in it. I'm soon going to discover this. It's race that makes a difference. Not just that a disproportionate number of people of color are going to find their way to death row, but the race of the victim. Overwhelmingly, it's when white people are killed in this country that the death penalty is pursued. When people of color are killed. 50% of all homicides in this country are people of color. Why, every single time they put the microscope down to examine that, when's the death penalty, when's it pursued and when is it not? When like Chattahoochee County in Georgia, when white people were killed 1 in every 5 times. Go visit with the family, ask the wishes of the family. Black people killed 1 in 19 times. Does that surprise us? Or is there a part of us that says, well, look, let's just make it fair. Let's just say no matter who's killed in this country, you can get the death penalty, and let's just do it across the board. And the truth is, in the history of this country, it has always been considered the greatest crime to do a crime against a white person or their property. And just look at the history. Look at the history when we had the death penalty for rape in this country. And over 355 people were hung from gallows or put in electric chairs. How many times do you think that was for the rape of a woman of color, a Native American woman, a Hispanic woman, a black woman? Almost always it was because white women had been raped. And nobody should be raped. I'm against violence across the board. No human being should be killed. Every human life is worth the whole universe, unique and irreplaceable. But isn't it odd? When we go to practice this thing, though we describe it as whoever does a heinous, cold blood or whatever, every state puts its criteria in there. When you come to the actual practice of it, in truth, the lives of some people taken means a whole lot more to us than the lives of other people taken. And look at this thing. And I've been to every state in this country. I mean, I was up in Alaska. I was in these different places. When we go to make our list as to who we're going to punish with death, what's considered the most ultimate terrible crime and murder, and you've got to make your list. I don't know what your list is in Oregon. New Hampshire has the most restrictive if you kill policemen. Most people add to the list because you can't start with, what about firefighters? Or children. Surely you should get the death penalty for killing children. But then you got to define what's a child, 12 or younger. And so picture yourself having the hearings to try to decide this, and this couple comes before the hearing and says, our son was killed. He was the light of our lives. He was brutally killed. He was gunned down. But our son was 14 years old. Are you telling us that because he wasn't 12, that therefore our son doesn't deserve the death penalty? We get into impossible situations, and then politics enters into it. Look at the anti-crime bill passed by Congress in '95. People are shingling in all kind of stuff. Federal poultry inspectors got in there for the death penalty. 50 new crimes for the death penalty. Well, throw that in. Somebody had a constituent who evidently inspected chickens or something. I don't know. But that's being put into the death penalty. Politics is in there because it's a way of getting points. I'm tough on crime. I'm tougher than him. And so the thing gets expanded, and where are we? Another moral thing we got to think about why we don't need this thing is juries. Juries are told, look, this group of people, this guy here, he killed these 3 people and he was reloading the gun to try to get the 4th. Well, boy, that sure seems to fit for the death penalty, doesn't it? This is and not only that, it's premeditated. He's reloading the gun to go for the 4th. 3 people have been killed. And then the lawyer here presents to you the jury. Did you know about him that when he was 3 years old, he was so abused, he was beaten with telephone cords, he was tied in his room? Do you know that every inch of his life, every moment of his life, from the time he was a child, he knew nothing about abuse? Did you know here about the mental problems that he's always had in his life, and that they tried to get him help, mental help, and he was turned down? And so he's this walking time bomb going around this society, and one day he explodes, and now the state that has done nothing for him now wants to kill him. And you, the jury, now are told, now you take this mitigating circumstances and you take the terrible crime and you go behind these closed doors. Now y'all take as long as you need. We'll bring your meals into you, and you decide if he should live or die. Putting that on human beings, they are just beginning to start to do the studies of what is the impact in jurors' lives who have made these death decisions. Sometimes pressure gets in there. It's got to be unanimous. 11 people saying one thing, one saying another. The pressure, people give in to the pressure, come out with their decision, and then have to live with it for the rest of their lives. Who can decide these things? We don't have to keep deciding these things. This is God's work to make those kind of decisions of wisdom like that. We don't have it. We could never get enough information to make that kind of decision. And because I got involved with this man, Patrick Saunier, and I began to visit him, and then I get involved with the murder victims' families. Didn't visit the families. He and his brother, Patrick, killed 2 teenage kids. It was, when I found out what they did, and I read it about these 2 innocent kids found lying face down near the sugarcane field in St. Martinville after coming from a football game on a Friday night. And now I know the people. I'm visiting with Pat and I'm visiting with Eddie. I know them. I stand behind their dignity, and then I know what they did. And just even reading about the kids with the bullet holes in the back, this is every parent's worst nightmare. These kids ripped out of life, the outrage we feel within ourselves when we hear these stories of what happens to innocent people. And I want to say that we need to stand in that outrage and not lessen that outrage. We need to feel it and we need to own it, because it's part of moral sensibility to feel outrage over crimes that happen in our community to innocent people. The moral question for us is going to be, what are we going to do with the outrage? And I think immediately of these kids' parents, and I think about going to see them. and I make a terrible mistake. And I had a great editor for my book because he said, Helen, when you write your book, tell about your mistakes. Don't just take people on the peaks of the waves where you do everything right. Talk about where, and I really made a mistake here because I stayed away from those parents. I wasn't sure how to handle it, and it was part cowardice too. I was just scared. And I met them at the pardon board hearing for Patrick Saunier, the worst time you want him. He couldn't be more polarized because by then everything is moving toward death. You come to the pardon board hearing, you got to sign to register which side you're on going in. It's the closest you come to going to a coliseum, thumbs up, thumbs down. And that's when I met them. The Bourke family's daughter had been killed. The LeBlancs, his son, had been killed. And I meet them outside the building at the pardon board hearing while they were inside voting. The Bourke family was so angry at me, they couldn't even speak to me. Like, where have you been? And here you are coming to say this guy shouldn't be executed, but you haven't been there for us. And how could they not see me as an enemy? I understood that. Right behind them was Lloyd LeBlanc, whose son David had been killed. And he comes right up to me, and he says, Sister, this is my wife, Eula. It was our son, David, who was killed. He said, Sister, where you been? I had nobody to talk to. You can't believe the pressure on us with the death penalty. I don't want to see anybody die, but the pressure on us, I haven't met anybody to talk to. I carry that the rest of my life because Lloyd LeBlanc did end up. Louisiana allows the victims' families to attend the execution, and he watched Patrick Saunier die in that electric chair, as did I, as his spiritual advisor. I could have maybe saved him from that because he said, I just want an apology. I want an explanation. I don't want to see anybody die. And he got ratcheted into that with nobody to support him, nobody to help him sound out his feelings or anything. And he's saying to me, Sister, where have you been? He was the first victim's family that took me by the hand and began to lead me down this road. And I talk about the roads on both sides of this cross in Dead Man Walking, with the murder victims' families being thrown, lightning hitting their lives, losing their child or losing their mother or losing their loved one. One of them said one time, they're on death row? Well, we're on death row too. Our family life has been destroyed. I was talking with a victim's family in Eugene whose wife was killed. He's trying to raise his kids. He is just in such chaos in his life. You can see it in his eyes, and when he's talking, he moves from one thing to the other, and you could just see the turmoil, the terrible killing of his wife. Here he is trying to, people's lives plunged into such chaos when one act, like lightning hitting them, happens to them. And from Lloyd LeBlanc then, and visiting with him and going into this little chapel to pray with him periodically and meeting his wife and getting to know this family, I began to go to these murder victim support groups. And then I got my second really big surprise. How many of them are saying, people leave us alone. After the funeral, nobody came to see us. Or when I try to talk about my daughter, people change the subject. Because they are in such white-hot pain, people kind of stay away because they don't know what to do, and they leave them alone. And then I realized then the need. You can't leave people alone in this kind of pain. And who better to help each other than those who have been through the pain and come out whole on the other end? And so we start a group in New Orleans called Survive. It's just one little bitty group. I didn't do it all over the country. But to do one thing to help human beings to heal and to help human beings to be accompanied and have community so that they are not alone. One thing. Look at all the potential sitting in this room today. Each of us does one thing to build our society or to transform it or to help it to be a more loving place where people are connected to one another. One thing. I have a friend. She's a lawyer. She's in Washington, D.C., and once a week, she goes into a homeless shelter with a little bag of books for the homeless kids and gives them a bag of books and reads to them one thing. And so for me with the victims, we start a group. And then across the years, these 15 years traveling, I have met incredible human beings. Victims' families, because everybody says, yeah, what if they did it to your children? What if they did it to your mother? How would you feel then? They've got the stories. They've got the witness. Marietta Yeager, child ripped out of a tent in Montana by a madman and killed, who stands before the world. She had to work it through against her Christian faith of Jesus and forgiveness and reconciliation, and stands before us and says, Susie was a very loving daughter, and I will not honor her memory by asking for the execution of an obviously very sick man. Bud Welch, Oklahoma City, his daughter Julie, the last one dug out of the rubble after 14 days. Bud Welch, who stands before the country and is candid and talks about after Julie was killed, he wanted to take Timothy McVeigh with his bare hands, and then being in the car one day and turning on the car radio, remembering Julie in the car with him, and the radio was on, and they were talking about an execution in Texas, and she says to him, Dad, that's about nothing but vengeance, and realizing Julie wouldn't want the execution of the one who killed her, and how can I be for it? This man who then seeks out Bill McVeigh, the father of Tim McVeigh, and the two men meet in Bill McVeigh's rose garden, and they put their arms around each other and they sob, and Bud Welch says to him, I don't want to see your son die. Everybody's story in here. Victims' families, does the death penalty help victims' families? 17,000 homicides, 1.5 to 2% of people selected for death. That's a very small percentage of victims' families. And does watching an execution, attending an execution, waiting for the execution, being promised closure when you see the execution, does it help human beings to heal? And I tell those stories in Dead Man Walking. One family, the Harveys, whose daughter's brutally killed, they watched the man executed in the electric chair who had killed their daughter, coming out of the execution and saying, the SOB died too quick. We hope he burns in hell. And realizing they could have watched him die every week if that was possible. But that chair at the dining room table that their daughter had sat in would forever be empty, because we are unique and irreplaceable beings. And when our lives are taken for whatever reason, we cannot be replaced. And to have a society that's going to promise healing and call it justice, to say we're going to do vengeance for you, and we're going to execute the one who killed your child, and you are going to feel a lot better. Watching them come out, other people I've accompanied along the way, what heals human beings I have found, even those who have been in this white-hot fire, is they are the children, family, community, faith communities, people who belong to faith communities of any kind, to churches, to periodically gather together the people in our church or our synagogue who have been hurt by violence, so the arms of the community can be around us, because it's an ongoing thing. Like we had a meeting of the victims' families in Oklahoma City, and I'll never forget that, because people are coming in, some with 2 hearing aids who had survived the blast, some the rescue workers who had had nervous breakdowns afterwards, who had seen such terrible stuff. And the whole conversation was around how can we heal, how can we move on. And there was a man sitting over to the right, very silent during the whole thing. And then finally he stood up. And everyone looked at him, because I guess some people knew who he was, I didn't. But he said, my daughter was killed in that blast. He said, let's not use that word closure anymore. With God's grace we can cope, we can move on. But closure? He said, every day of my life I will think of my daughter. And every night before I go to sleep, I will think of my daughter. Don't promise me closure. And so part of the legitimation of the death penalty that we hear is, we need to do it for victims' families. First of all, think of how few it is. Think about the nature of what it is itself, and whether or not that can heal people. And then sometimes it splits murder victims' families right down the middle. I know a family in Baton Rouge right now. Their sister was killed. The brothers all for the death penalty, and they writing letters to the editor calling for it. The sisters are against the death penalty, and it has put a continental divide right down that family. And the poor mother who lost her child now sees her children divided. Some niece in the family is sending a letter around all the different family members saying, can we just stop being public about this? Can we just all get together? We can't presume that in victims' families everybody's of one mind as to what kind of punishment they want to see happen to somebody. And so we come to Oregon. And you know why I'm in Oregon? I'm in Oregon because I think we have a chance here with you. And I don't know what it is about Oregonians. I know y'all are the first ones to take bottles and say, instead of just littering with the bottles, why don't we turn the bottles in and everybody gets a nickel for the bottles? And you were the first ones in the country to do this, and I think that's a great symptom of a mindset that maybe we can recycle things and save things and restore things, and we don't have to throw things away. Because the death penalty is the biggest throwaway program that we have. People are disposable human waste, and the only thing we know is to really definitively throw them away by killing them. And so there's an initiative in this state offering Oregonians a choice in life without parole and restitution to victims, and it's a ballot initiative. And boy, when I heard that was going on here, plus the sparks of light that are beginning to come in other parts of the country. I'm sure you heard the Illinois governor had to call a moratorium. Well, they had 13 innocent people and they executed 12. That's not a really good track record for your state to have. But Nebraska, same thing, movement for a moratorium. We're aware of the innocent people who've come off a death row. We don't see the thing working anyway. And we've been knowing for 10 years that if you ask people, not in the abstract, but give them an alternative to the death penalty, because one of the things fueling the death penalty is that people want to be safe. So when people know real life without parole, our kids are going to be safe, our families are going to be safe, then we don't need to keep doing this. And it's so selective anyway. You could take your 25 people you got sitting on death row in Oregon and put them into prison tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. There'd barely be a ripple, and you're going to save yourself millions of dollars. Because even district attorneys are the first to say that the death penalty or capital punishment is a Cadillac in the criminal justice system. It's got 1,480 parts to it, where everything else is relatively simple, including the picking of the jury, 2 trials. Everything about it's more expensive. Think what could happen in Oregon if you took those resources and poured them into the needs of the community. You're the highest in the country in hunger. You're the top of the 50 states in hunger in Oregon, because you have so many rural sections in Oregon. Put it into literacy. Put it into at-risk kids. Put it into kids in public schools. Put it into good child care programs for kids so they're not growing up and all disconnected and someday going to go out and do acts of violence. It's a wonderful choice for Oregon. And the polls already show that people are with us on this. Give them a chance to be safe. And also restitution of victims. You'll be the first state to do that. Because the purpose of the criminal justice system is not to address the needs of victims directly. Civil law is that. Someone's been hurt, you have a suit, and the victim can be addressed. Criminal law, it's to apprehend the criminal, punish the criminal, separate the criminal from society, but not directly to help victims, and it's never going to help victims. But you have in this Life for Life campaign that's beginning to go on, which is why I'm here, a choice on that ballot to register that you want, instead of the death penalty in Oregon, life without parole and restitution for victims. You can't beat that. And I got a feeling deep in my bones that Oregon's going to be the first one to do it. And when you do it, you're going to be a beacon on the hill for all of us. And you're going to be a sign, and you're going to be an example of a state that chooses this as the road and shows the rest of us that it can be done. The program's called Life for Life. They need a lot of workers. They got to get a lot of signatures, got to get about 100,000 signatures, because it's going to be on the ballot in November. I hope some of you will be moved to work for it. You can look it up in the phone book. It's based here in Portland. Life for a Life is the name of it. Let me stop here. How did I do with my timeline? Were you getting nervous? I did all right? Okay, perfect, he says. Okay. All right. Let me just stop here, because the rest can come from our questions and our discussions together. I hear you ask very perceptive questions in this group, so don't let me down. You do the first, our first perceptive question.
Sister Helen, in Oregon, on several occasions, Oregon voters have abolished the death penalty, and then we have reinstated it during this century. And I'm sure that that kind of movement and counter-movement has occurred in other places in the country. Based upon the people that you've met and the thinking that you've done about this issue, what is it, if there are one or two things that come to mind, what is it that causes people to go back and forth?
Not many people go back and forth. Louisiana's been so socked into this thing, we never went back and forth. The southern states have it locked in. You don't have this thing, and that to me is a sign of hope. It shows Oregonians, you go for it and then the mood shifts. The fact that you have gone back and forth means that the soil is porous here of questions about it. And I have found, talking to people across this country, a deep ambivalence about the death penalty. I think the going back and forth does register that ambivalence. The ambivalence because we are outraged about the terrible crimes people do, and we do have a fear and the need for safety. And on the other hand, especially now with all the innocent people coming off of death row and we see how flawed it is, we know it's hard to trust government even to get the potholes filled, to collect the taxes. And we're going to entrust over the decision for life and death of killing some of our citizens, of letting them live. And I think there is that deep ambivalence in us. And the fact that you have had it, taken it back, had it, taken it back. What's helpful now, we're just beginning to see a thaw nationwide in the death penalty. ABC just did a national poll. And it's when the question's asked in the abstract, which shows the highest support. You know, what are the numbers we usually hear for support for the death penalty? 70, 75%, some southern states 80%. This national poll shows that support has fallen 15, 20 points over the last 5 years, and I think it has to do with a lot of, there's more knowledge. It's down to 61%. That's just when the question's asked, you believe in the death penalty, people to commit first-degree felony murder. Down to 61% from 75. Now, that's not below 50, but here's the thing, and I was just in Kentucky. Now, we're talking Kentucky. We're not talking Oregon, okay? And they've had a death penalty for a long, long time. They just did a poll there. The people who said in the first question that they believed in the death penalty, when they were asked, well, what about if you had life without parole instead of the death penalty? Support in Kentucky for the death penalty dropped to 31%. See, and people want to be safe. And of course, that's the first role of our society, is to make it safe for people. And that's different from the argument that we want vengeance. Safety is different from retribution. We want to be safe. I've met all these good and decent people in this country. We don't have a vengeful society where people are saying, let's fry people and put them in gas chambers. We're doing that. We don't have much information about the death penalty, and we think it's the only way we can really be safe. And it's got nothing to do with safety, because it has nothing to do with deterrence. And if we don't deal with the walking time bombs we have among us, that's the real thing for safety, is to deal with the roots of crime and violence. Somebody else. Our comment. Maybe people want to, in the interest of time, come up to the mic so that.
Sister Prejean, Greg McPherson City Club member. The governor of Illinois was motivated to suspend the death penalty because of some celebrated cases in which it was found that innocent people were on death row. To what extent do the greater procedural protections that theoretically are available in the capital process assure a higher probability of finding real guilt, or do you think that if we substitute life for life, that we'll have even a lower probability of finding real justice for people who are convicted?
Well, all I know is that what's been going on in the courts is that habeas has really been stripped back down to the bone. They had a thing on Frontline the other night. They showed a man in Texas, in prison. There are 2 DNA tests that show his innocence. 2 DNA tests that showed that he could not have raped this person. And so, and Texas is keeping him in prison. And the judges were saying, We need proof of absolute innocence. And what this is saying to us is, if you don't get justice at your trial, forget it in the appeals process, because the gate's shut. The bar, the procedural bars of, for example, like ineffectiveness of assistance, are almost impossible to show. Dobie Williams, the last person I accompanied to death a year ago in January, his lawyer was he's a black man. He's on trial for his life for the killing of a white woman, and an all-white jury seated as the jury of his peers. Every court in the land upheld that. And you know what they said? His lawyer didn't raise an objection. So then you go and say, well, he had ineffectiveness at counsel. Impossible. I document cases in my book of lawyers taking these trials, sleeping during a trial, on drugs during a trial, so hopelessly inept that you have in the transcript where you come to the sentencing part of the trial and the judge says, okay, we're going to move to sentencing tomorrow, and you have the defense attorney saying, Your Honor, I don't know anything about that. I've never done one of these before. And so he says, now you go bone up overnight. We're going to meet here at 9 o'clock. And the courts upheld that, not ineffective. The Strickland decision of U.S. Supreme Court has made it almost impossible to uphold ineffectiveness of counsel. And so it's like the courts, because of the political mindset of the courts, have stripped and stripped and stripped. And so if you don't get justice at trial, the chances of an appeal. Now they've made the bar so high, you know, with the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, saying that basically a federal court has to find a state court unreasonable. Now, what federal court reviewing what a state court has done? Of course, when people disagree with each other, they give different reasons. But the bar, you got to find them unreasonable, and that's almost impossible. And so now it just means basically that what happens in those state courts, and especially at the trial, is what's going to hold all the way through. And these innocent people we hear coming off, it's not because of the review thing in the court where they go, oh, this was ineffectiveness of counsel. We need to go back and do this again. Oh, look, a black man on trial for his life and he has an all-white jury and a white victim. That's not what the No, they're upholding all of it. And they're greasing the tracks and trying to expedite executions. How that would affect other people with life for life, I don't know as much. I just am more conscious of how it affects people who get the death penalty. Yes, sir.
Dan Goldie, member. You just described eloquently what happens in many states where there is not adequate defense counsel, particularly for indigent people who are before the bar on capital crimes. In Texas, I want you commented about Kentucky, but I want you to turn your attention to Texas, where the legislature virtually unanimously passed legislation to correct what they thought was a serious deficiency in their laws providing defense counsel to indigent people. And you've got the largest collection of people on death row of any state in the country in Texas.
What did they correct?
Well, my question is this: when Governor Bush vetoed this bill because the judges who were in control of the process wanted to keep the system the way it was, what does this say? He's obviously a politically sensitive governor. What does it say about the attitudes of the state that they would tolerate that kind of action?
And let me add about Texas, that there's fierce opposition from the district attorneys to have life without parole as the alternative to the death penalty in Texas. Guess why? Okay? Because one of the things is, if you have life without parole and juries, I mean, they've even done this study in Virginia, and people, when they go to vote and cast their vote for death or life, and they know it'll be life without parole, and they have that knowledge, they tend to start putting their vote for life. And they don't want to have that happen. So they don't even want to allow the alternative of life without parole. And George W. Bush, that was right about that politically sensitive. He's very politically sensitive. And he and every other politician, I don't want to just put George W. Bush out there, Because, I mean, people are all coming along this political highway, and they're not letting anybody pass them on the right, except maybe some folks in Oregon who's got some fresh thinking about things, okay? The death penalty is par excellence a political issue because it's a symbol. And I have had politicians pull me aside. People like to break things down for nuns. Sister, come here, let me explain this to you, kind of thing. And say to me, personally, me, myself, personally, my conscience, I'm against the death penalty. But sister, I can't be elected. My opponent in this last campaign, he had 10 times the amount of money I did, and he's going to get on there with those TV campaign ads and point at me, soft on crime, if I had said I was against the death penalty. And I never could have gotten the other issues out. I never could have got elected. It just would be one image after another with this negative campaign. So I said, I'm for the death penalty too, so I didn't give him that vulnerable flank. And now I got elected. I'm not going to push for the death penalty. I'm going to try to do some good stuff. They are scared to death of this issue. Scared to death. The last politician in this country who stood principled against the death penalty was Mario Cuomo. Tony Anaya, before he left his governorship in New Mexico, commuted 10 sentences and saved the lives of those people before he left office. A firestorm broke over his head. People were calling him, they were mad, but you know what Tony Anaya said? Some people stopped him in airports and said, we respect you because you acted out of principle. Disagree with what you did, but just respect that you acted out of principle and not out of expediency. And we need that. What we need, though, in the challenge to politicians, because they're going to say it's what the people want. What do the people of Oregon really want? Are you talking about the poll where you didn't give people an alternative of life without parole? And of course they're doing that all the time now in Oregon, and you're going to fit in just like with the other states. We've been knowing this for 10 years, and when people are given the option of life without parole over against the death penalty, support drops precipitously, and add to it restitution for victims, and you got below 50%. So where's the mandate from the people now for the death penalty? I think we can challenge them on that and help them. I don't mean to challenge them in a way like you're a hypocrite and you're a politician and y'all are all corrupt. When I meet with governors and when I meet with people, I say to them, what is a graceful way that we might help you to do the right thing on this issue? What is it that you need? What's a graceful way to help you to stand in this issue for life and not for the death penalty? What is it that you need? Yes.
B.J. Seymour, City Club member. I remember years ago when Nathan Leopold, who was one of the most horrendous murderers in history, was being considered for release. Can murderers be rehabilitated, do you think? And how do people decide? And how do we achieve safety if we're willing to consider the possibility that a murderer could be rehabilitated?
How long has Leopold been in prison? Long time, huh?
He had been, he was 18 or something when he went to prison, and he was 50 or 60 when he finally was let out for a few years and died a few years later.
Yeah. Let me just say this. Within the last 10 years, state legislatures all across this country have tightened up sentencing for first degree or felony murder. They all have. And so people sentenced now, like take California, they put in life without parole 25 years ago, and nobody has walked out of prison under those new sentencing things. For first degree and felony murder, the sentencing sticks. Also, you get to governors, they're not about to commute sentence of people, you know, I mean, they're very political animals, they're not about to do that. So the possibility of governors, you look at commutations of sentences, it is down to a fine, fine little trickle, if not non-existent. Over the last 15 years, governors used to commute more sentences and change them from death to life or whatever. And I'm just addressing here death penalty, and I'm addressing the sentencing for first degree and felony murder. We are going to have to deal, though, with this whole thing of prison. I mean, 50% of people are in prisons for nonviolent crimes, and we are throwing the book at them, and we got the most expensive welfare system in the world. We are building prisons, and we're cutting education budgets. And that's a downward spiral for a society to take.